Life in a tub. Point 1. See the wretch that long has tossed on the thorny bed of pain, at length repair his vigor lost, and breathe and walk again. Gray. Perhaps there is nothing more characteristic of the march of intellect of the present day, or more indicative of a healthy tone of mind, than the suspicion with which the public in general, and many physicians in particular, are beginning to regard the use of drugs as curative agents, that chiefest engine of the allopathic physician for the relief of suffering humanity. The freeing of the mind from old and preconceived ideas, from practices with which we have been familiarized from childhood, the looking with distrust upon a system which since the times of Aesculapius and Hippocrates has held undisputed sway, arrogating to itself the name of orthodox, and dubbing its opponents as quacks. Such a change in public opinion deserves respect or reprobation, according to the causes from which it springs, whether from a calm investigation of the question presented for examination, in which strong arguments, based on natural laws, prescribing a treatment which produces the results aimed at, are found to preponderate in favor of a new system, or from a revolutionary love of novelty, indicative of versatility and want of faith in established institutions, a love of change which would espouse and propagate any doctrine irrespective of its merits, merely because it was new. That this change of opinion to which we refer, viz., the want of confidence in drugs, is not altogether frivolous, would, 6, appear from the following confession of Dr. Forbes, a distinguished allopathic physician, who thus sums up the experience of a long professional career. Firstly, that in a large proportion of the cases treated by allopathic physicians, the disease is cured by nature and not by them. Secondly, that in a lesser, but still not a small proportion, the disease is cured by nature in spite of them, in other words, their interference opposing instead of assisting the cure. And thirdly, that consequently in a considerable proportion of diseases it would fare as well or better with patients, if all remedies, especially drugs, were abandoned. Again, one of the most eminent of living medical writers says, when healthy properties are impaired, we know of no agent by which they can be directly restored. When vital action is perverted or deranged, we possess no means of immediately rectifying it. But we must be satisfied with using those means under which it is most likely to rectify itself. It is the knowledge of these facts that has produced discontent with the usual mode of medicinal treatment, and has encouraged the belief that it does more harm than good in cases of disease. Dr. Gully states, by it, the drug system, the body is placed in the most unnatural position, and its efforts at relief constantly thwarted. Disease, which is quite as natural a process as health, is not allowed to go on as nature would. The internal organs whose morbid action alone can cause death are made the arena for all sorts of conflicting and inflicting medical stimulants, and between the action which these excite and that which originally existed, their vitality fails, their efforts towards restoration flag, and their functions are at last extinguished. Dr. Rush says, we have multiplied diseases, we have done more, we have increased their mortality. The celebrated Dr. Bailey, who enjoyed, it appears, a long and lucrative practice, declared at the termination of his career that he had no faith in physic, and on his deathbed frequently exclaimed, I wish I could be sure that I have not killed more than I have cured. Abernethy observes sarcastically, there's been a great increase of medical men of late years, but upon my life, diseases have increased in proportion. The British and Foreign Quarterly Journal, the leading advocate of drug medication, thus writes, this mode of treating disease, hydropathy, is unquestionably far from inert, and most opposed to the cure of diseases by the undisturbed processes of nature. It in fact perhaps affords the very best evidence we possess of the curative power of art, and is unquestionably, when rationally, 7, regulated, a most effective mode of treatment in many diseases. Still it puts in a striking light, if not exactly the curative powers of nature, at least the possibility, nay, facility, with which all the ordinary instruments of medical cure, drugs, may be dispensed with. If so many and such various diseases get well entirely without drugs, under one special mode of treatment, is it not more than probable that a treatment consisting almost exclusively of drugs may be often of non-effect, sometimes of injurious effect? Dr. Headland, in his prize essay on the action of medicines on the system, thus writes, on no question perhaps have scientific men differed more than on the theory of the action of medicines. Either facts, essentially opposed and incompatible, have been adduced by the disagreeing parties, or which is nearly as common, the same fact has received two distinct and opposite interpretations. Such quotations as the above, which might be multiplied ad infinitum by any student of medical lore, show that inquiry is abroad amongst the medical profession, and that some at least of its members are dissatisfied with the truth of the system which would consider drug medication as an essential instrument in the cure of disease. The following remarks by Dr. MacLeod, contained in a letter written by him to Professor Simpson of Edinburgh, show at least that if the lay public place confidence in allopathic drugging, they place their faith in a system which does not command the confidence of physicians themselves. Formerly there were several wards in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, of which 3 fellows of the Royal College of Physicians had the charge. One physician had the top ward, another the middle ward, and a third the low ward. It happened that on the same day, 3 young persons of nearly the same age, ill of typhus fever, were admitted into the hospital. The disease was of equal severity in each, and the stage of complaint the same in all. What was the treatment pursued in those 3 cases by the 3 fellows of the college? Of course, it should have been the same, at least, if the system be correct, for the physicians in question would choose the best. But, sir, it was not the same. He in the top ward bled his patient with lancet and leeches. He in the middle ward treated his patient with drastic purgatives. He in the low ward, again, gave whiskey, wine, and opiates. What was the result of such deplorable freaks? I refer you to the statistic book. I have no doubt you will find it there. In the university formerly, 2 professors used to lecture, on alternate days, on clinical medicine. It happened once that each had, at the same time, under his care an acute case of pericarditis. The professor who lectured on his case on Monday night said in substance as follows: "Gentlemen, as to the treatment of this disease, it has been the practice to give large doses of mercury so as to bring the constitution under its action, and to effect this as rapidly as possible, small quantities of opium are usually combined with it. The practice I, however, believe, to be erroneous, for I have observed the progress of the disease unchecked, even during profuse salivation. The most efficient remedy, in fact our sheet anchor, in this disease is tartar emetic. You will have noticed the large doses I have given of this remedy, and yet the patient seems not to suffer from it. In fact, the constitution in this disease, as in some others, has a remarkable tolerance for tartar emetic." When the lecture was finished, I left the hall fancying I had heard some great truth, and knew better than an hour before how to save life. On Wednesday evening, during the same week, in the same hall, and to the same students, the other professor lectured. The lecture was devoted to the acute case of pericarditis under his care in the hospital. After describing the case, and giving a sketch of the character and progress of the disease, he spoke in substance as follows: "Gentlemen, it is a remarkable thing that there should be any difference in regard to the mode of treatment to be pursued in a disease such as this. I believe it is the Italian and French schools which advocate so very strongly the employment of tartar emetic. But I would strongly urge you to put no confidence in this remedy, for if you do so, you will lean on a broken reed. Our sheet anchor in this disease is mercury, under the action of which you must bring the patient as soon and as freely as you possibly can. Even bleeding is of little importance in comparison with the use of mercury. The 2 combined, i.e., mercury and bloodletting is, of course, best, but at all events use mercury, and never trust to tartar emetic. Thus doctors differ and the patient dies. As in the theatrical world, a peep behind the scenes destroys the illusion of the piece, so in the real world such revelations as the foregoing are well calculated to stagger thoughtful minds, and to shake to the center a blind and unreasoning faith in the allopathic system. Does not the reflection suggest itself on reading such a revelation as the above, since it is impossible that the practice of both these learned professors can be right, is it not possible that the practice of both may be wrong? That eminent physician, the late Sir Philip Crampton, was in the habit of warning all his gouty and rheumatic patients to avoid the use of colchicum, terming it a desperate remedy, and affirming that it was better to bear any amount of pain than have recourse to it. This was the deliberate opinion of one of the most able men in his profession, who must have been fully impressed with the conviction of its injurious effects, yet this remedy is continued to be prescribed to thousands, with what result let those who have experienced it testify. Here then again is a serious disagreement in practice between members of the medical profession, in which one party must again be wrong. If those who use colchicum are to be ranged amongst the latter, where our own sufferings, 9, under it would place them, their victims may well be pitied. Take another example from the process of wet sheet packing. and examine its effects in subduing inflammatory and febrile affections. By this simple process, the pulse is often reduced from 120 pulsations per minute to 65. In a short period of 3/4 of an hour, the circulation equalized throughout the body, and a soothing effect produced on the patient, which language fails to describe, a result which no drug or combination of drugs, in the whole of the pharmacopoeia, is capable of producing. In this case, again, little lowering of strength is produced, and the stomach is again saved from the injurious and irritating effects of tartar emetic and other drugs. Instead of the fever raging for a period of 3 weeks, it is generally subdued in as many days when the patient goes forth, but little reduced in strength, instead of weak, miserable, and emaciated, with the prospect of some 6 weeks elapsing before he is restored to his wonted strength. Sir Bulwer-Lytton thus describes, from personal experience, the process of wet sheet packing. The sheet, after being well saturated, is well wrung out, the patient quickly wrapped in it, several blankets bandaged round, a down coverlet tucked over all. Thus, especially where there is the least fever, the first momentary chill is promptly succeeded by a gradual and vivifying warmth perfectly free from the irritation of dry heat. A delicious sense of ease is usually followed by a sleep more agreeable than anodyne ever produced. It seems a positive cruelty to be taken out of this magic girdle in which pain is lulled and fever cooled, and watchfulness lapped in slumber. In the effects of wet sheet packing in cases of congestion of the liver and other internal viscera, we fear an unfavorable comparison must again be drawn between the effects of the allopathic and hydropathic modes of treatment. In these cases, the object to be effected is to relieve the oppressed and congested organs from the superabundance of blood with which they are gorged, and it appears to us that this effect is produced more certainly, more quickly, and more permanently, without subsequent injurious effects, by the wet sheet packing and other hydropathic appliances, sitz baths amongst the rest, than could possibly be effected by all the drugs in the apothecary's hall. In fact, hydropathy appears to possess 13 greater power in controlling the circulation and regulating the currents of the blood than any other system of therapeutics yet revealed to us. It can stimulate the circulation when low, reduce it when excited and disordered, determine it from the head in cases of apoplexy and cold feet, and drive it to the surface of the body in cases of visceral congestion. An engine capable of producing these effects without weakening the constitution, and possessing, in addition, the power of bracing and stimulating the nervous system when weakened, and of soothing and allaying irritation wherever it may exist, more effectually than any opiate. Such a system, we say, must ever occupy a high, if not the foremost place amongst all existing systems of hygiene. The physiological effects of wet sheet packing are thus described by Dr. Wilson. It fulfills many indications according to the various phases of disease. If you revert to what I have said of the specific actions and effects of the packing process, you will see sufficient ground for our using the invaluable aid of the wet sheet in chronic disease. We often want heat to be abstracted in these diseases. We want the nerves soothed, the circulation equalized, muscles rested, fatigue removed, a movement of the fluids to be determined to the surface, interior congestions to be disgorged, the equilibrium of the fluids established, secretions and exhalations to be promoted, ill-conditioned solids to be broken up and eliminated, the tissues of the skin to be soaked, its capillaries to be emptied and cleansed, its sentient extremities to be soothed, and through them the brain to be quieted on the one hand, and the ganglionic 3 system to be roused on the other. How many lives have been sacrificed by the practice of bleeding in feverish and inflammatory cases, from the non-adoption of wet sheet packing, which causes no loss of strength, and leaves behind none of the debility and consequent long convalescence, which bleeding and strong medicines necessarily occasion. It is to us, indeed, inexplicable how so insane a process as bleeding can still be resorted to in this enlightened 19th century, a process which deprives nature of her vital fluid, and lets flow the stream on which our very existence depends. Point 4. How can this tapping of the springs of life, 14, be defended when an expedient for lowering inflammation without reducing the strength presents itself for adoption by the physician, one which by its action purifies the blood, reducing fever by the abstraction of heat, and by the removal of the serum or watery constituent of the blood, which contains all its impurities? Will the public, then, place confidence in the physician who, when invited to cure them, would weaken them by bleeding and assist the operations of nature by depriving her of that vital fluid, on the existence of which her powers of self-restoration depend? Will they prefer a system which ensures a long convalescence to the patient to that in which he recovers from his disease without any sensible diminution of his strength or injury to his constitution? In short, the operation of wet sheet packing is so extraordinary and satisfactory in its results that he who refuses to make use of it must lag behind, whilst success will attend the efforts of him who judiciously applies it in the cases to which it is suited. The compress and hot stew next demand our attention. Both are usually applied to the stomach, the latter consisting of a vulcanized India rubber bag filled with hot water, which is laid over a towel, the underfolds of which are moistened and placed next to the body, a most efficient and convenient form of fomentation. These remedies are applied in the treatment of nearly all chronic diseases where there is morbid action of the stomach, liver, or kidneys. This form of stew, Dr. Wilson calls the ne plus ultra of poulticing, soothing and derivation being by it most perfectly obtained and in the greatest degree. Each operation has on deep-seated chronic irritation as one of its qualities the advantageous effect of a mild blister or mustard plaister without any of its drawbacks, and in acute inflammations, in all nervous or neuralgic pains, in the sufferings of colic, biliousness, or sickness of the stomach, or other digestive derangements from dietetic errors, and in the malaise ushering in fevers and inflammations, in sore throat, and or affections of the lungs and air tubes. It is then found to be the most agreeable and potent anodyne and equalizer of the circulation. It, in effect, accomplishes the most salutary operations of opiates without any risk of congesting the liver or producing that sickness and atony of the stomach, and all but paralysis of the lower bowels which result from the use of narcotic drugs. No nervous irritations, says Dr. Wilson, no visceral congestions, especially if of recent formation, but are soon relieved by this powerful revulsive rubefacient and anodyne. With the dissipation of those interior, 15, congestions comes the solution of pains and spasms, or flatulence which may have risen to a severe state of suffering, the release of bilious and nervous headaches, neuralgic pains, asthmatic fits, and these have all their origin near or remote in visceral obstructions, congestions, and in most cases where for a longer or a shorter time any organic action has been embarrassed, sleep banished or disquieted, and the patient irritated and exhausted to the last degree, by aid of the fomentations. In a brief time organic calm takes the place of organic tumult, ease succeeds to agitation, and the whole apparatus feels to work normally and with renewed alacrity. What I have just described, you may frequently hear repeated and descanted upon in the same strain by my patients. The effect of the hot stew in the removal of irritation from the viscera, the immediate cause of dysentery, and is very remarkable, and from our knowledge of its effects, we have often regretted that so simple and rational an expedient was not resorted to in the treatment of those diseases by which our noble army was more than decimated in the late Crimean campaign. On this subject Dr. Wilson remarks, "So strong was my conviction that I wrote to my good friend Lord Rogby, requesting him to offer my service through Mr. Sidney Herbert. I offered to go and remain there, at Scutari, entirely at my own expense, not as a water doctor, but as an ordinary medical practitioner, willing to lend a hand and make himself generally useful. I stated that I had almost lived in hospitals for 7 years, had afterwards witnessed the practice of nearly every great hospital in Europe, and could undertake simple operations, and any amputations with little preparation, had been 25 years in practice. After some weeks I received a polite letter thanking me, but fearing it could not be done, not being quite the custom. About this time there was an outcry for medical men. Those at the hospitals were too few for the work. They were worn out with fatigue." Further on he adds, "I have had a great many patients suffering under chronic diseases from climate, exposure, and want of care, and patients from India, Ceylon, and the Antipodes, with long continued diarrhea, dysentery, and intractable fever of an intermittent character. From the success of this simple treatment in those cases, I have not ceased to regret that I did not go to Scutari on my own account without permit or introduction. I might have introduced the practice gradually, being sure that it only required a trial to have been adopted by the medical staff with great satisfaction." We join Dr. Wilson heartily in this regret, as it would have led to the introduction of this remedy if proved efficient, and silenced its advocates if it proved a failure. Nowhere could the two systems have been more severely and satisfactorily tested, and we should all have benefited by the result. The relative merits of the two systems would have been decided, and the public no longer left to hang in doubt between them. The sitz bath and foot bath come next in point of importance. 16. The former acts with marked effect in cases of congestion of the liver and other internal organs, by abstracting heat from the surface of the body submitted to its influence. It causes a transference of fluids from the center to the exterior, and the congested organs are relieved from their excess of blood by its being thus determined to the surface. This effect, at first temporary, becomes permanent when the use of the bath has been persevered in for some time. Let us now compare the effects of this bath, in the cases of congestion of the liver, with the treatment usually pursued by the orthodox physicians. Their remedies consist in dosing with calomel or taraxacum, or in the application of leeches to the affected region. The two former stimulate the action of the liver, in spite of the congested blood which oppresses it, but they do not attempt to deal with the causes of this congestion, the result of which is that the liver, being weakened by its unnatural exertions consequent on the unnatural stimulants which have been administered to it, sinks, after the effect of the unnatural stimulus has worn away, into a more enfeebled and exhausted state, and the original cause of the congestion remaining unremoved. Matters become worse than at first. In the case of leeching, the topical bleeding relieves the affection for a time, but this is a remedy which cannot be repeated in consequence of the weakness which it engenders, and when the bleeding is given up, how do matters stand? The disease remains in statu quo, not so, however, the constitution, for this has been weakened by the bleeding, and nature being consequently less able to cure herself, chronic disease of the liver results. On the other hand, the hydropathic treatment necessary to determine the blood from the congested organ to the surface, and so remove the disease, can be repeated as often as desirable, with constantly increasing effect, until permanent relief is afforded by a perseverance in the treatment, and the patient improves in general health, pari passu, with the cure of his particular disease. The effects of the sitz bath are, it appears, either tonic or relaxing according to the length of time during which it is administered. If a tonic effect is desired, a period varying from 10 to 15 minutes is prescribed. If a relaxing or derivative effect is to be produced, the period is extended to half an hour or 45 minutes. We should have thought it superfluous to make any observations on the evil effects of mercury, which we thought were 17, acknowledged by everybody, were it not that we recently heard it designated by a much respected physician as a most wholesome substance, the chief objection to it being that persons got too fat upon it. This opinion astonished us not a little, and we felt that when habit 5 and prejudice could so pervert the mind of a physician as to make him look upon a poisonous substance as a positive good, we could easily account for the difficulty which has been always experienced in converting a medical man, for the unsatisfactory state of the medical art, and its having so long pertinaciously followed the routine practice of our ancestors. When a mind cannot perceive the difference between black and white, it is in vain to place less obvious differences before it. We now quote the opinion of Dietrich as to the effects of this wholesome ingredient, mercury, for the benefit of the physician in question, and such of our readers as may hitherto have agreed with him. He tells us that, soon after salivation has been established, the blood exhibits an inflammatory crust. At a later period, its color deepens, and its coagulability is diminished, the proportion of clot, and, therefore, of fibrin to serum, or watery part, becomes smaller. The formation of albumin and mucus sinks to that of serum. The whole organic formation of the patient is less consistent and cohesive. Which opinion is right, let the public judge. We will not prejudice their verdict by any further observations of ours, but will merely ask them, if mercury be proved unnecessary, how can its continued use be defended? Dr. Faré writes sportively as follows. A full, plethoric woman, of a purple-red complexion, consulted me *****. I gave her mercury, and in 6 weeks blanched her as white as a lily. If this be what the allopathist boasts of, and one of the effects he aims at producing, we congratulate him on the melancholy success which usually attends his efforts. As regards the use of the foot bath, we may observe that the theory of its administration subverts all our preconceived notions respecting the proper mode of treating those affections for which it is usually prescribed. For instance, the old mode of proceeding in affections of blood to the head, or in cases of cold feet, was to apply cold to the head and warmth to the feet, in the shape of hot flannels, hot bricks, and hot stoops. 18. Now the hydropathic mode of treatment is the very reverse of this, viz., to bathe the head in tepid, and place the feet in cold water to about the depth of 3 inches, up to the ankles, friction of the feet accompanying their immersion, the whole being continued for about 10 minutes. Let any person suffering from cold feet try this remedy, and he will satisfy himself of the truth of the principles which enjoin it. Its rationale is as follows: the application of warm water to the head, of the same temperature as the body, does not increase the flow of blood to it, whilst the subsequent evaporation from the moist and warm surface of the head cools it gradually, and so diminishes the flow of blood to it, whilst the cold application to the feet has, for a secondary result, the attraction and retention in those parts of great quantity of blood, and consequently of increased temperature there. In fact, continues Dr. Gully, a cold foot bath of 12 or 15 minutes, followed by a walk of half an hour, is the most certain way to warm the feet that can be devised, just as, per contra, the most certain way to ensure cold feet is to soak them in hot water. The same applies to the hands. When the patient is in a condition to take it, a walk is necessary to obtain the circulating reaction alluded to, he adds. The warmth remains for several hours. Very frequently, I have heard persons say that they have not known cold feet since they began to take cold foot baths. With respect to bathing generally, very erroneous opinions appear to prevail, two of which only we will notice. First, that for delicate constitutions bathing is dangerous, because no reaction takes place in the system. Secondly, that it is dangerous to bathe in cold water when the body is heated. To the first we answer that no matter how delicate the constitution may be, reaction can always be obtained if water of a proper temperature be used. This temperature will vary with the vitality of the individual. The more delicate the individual, the warmer the water must be. A delicate person will often receive the same shock and benefit to his system from water at a temperature of 80 degrees as a strong man may, perhaps, receive from water at a temperature of 42 degrees. To the second we reply that a more erroneous opinion could not by possibility prevail, and that the idea in question is exactly the opposite of the truth, the fact being that the body cannot be too warm for cold bathing, always provided that such warmth has not been produced at the cost of bodily languor and fatigue, as in such cases the system will be too much weakened to react after the 19 bath with effect. But with this exception, the warmer the body, the greater will be the reaction and benefit received, and the longer may the bather continue with impunity to luxuriate in the bath. The body is never so well calculated to withstand the effects of cold as when it is heated, and the only danger to be apprehended from cold bathing is that arising from entering the water in a chilled condition, when, from the low vitality of the body, the subsequent reaction becomes imperfect. Let these maxims be remembered, that without subsequent reaction, no bath is beneficial. Therefore, water should be always used of a proper temperature to secure reaction, and exercise to warmth, taken immediately before and after a cold bath. When practicable, that the colder the bath, provided reaction follows, the greater its benefit, the reaction being always a mean proportional between the temperature of the bather and the water in which he bathes. Whenever bathing is found to disagree with any person, it will be always found that some of the preceding conditions have been neglected, a very common fault being that of entering the water in a chilled state, and remaining there for 20 minutes, when 5 would have proved, perhaps, more than sufficient. Then headache, languor, and chilliness succeed, and we are told that bathing disagrees. With such bathing, the wonder would be that it did not. We would next make some observations on the different modes of treating pulmonary consumption, that fatal and mysterious disease, which has so long baffled the curative efforts of the most eminent physicians of their day. And it is gratifying to find that a great step towards a rational and successful mode of treatment, based on sound physiological principles, has lately obtained in its case, which mode we hope soon to see generally adopted by the medical profession. Point 6. The unsuccessful treatment of this disease has hitherto cast a slur on medical science, and it is not to be wondered at that little success should have attended on the orthodox mode of treatment, since recent observation and matured experience have shown, on physiological principles, that no worse mode could have been devised for curing, nor surer one adopted for aggravating the disease. This new view of the matter is, 20, very ably set forth in Dr. Lane's work, which we heartily recommend to the perusal of our readers, as a sensible and modest statement of the benefits resulting from hydropathic treatment in cases of that nature. Dr. Lane looks upon consumption as essentially a blood disease, in which opinion he is confirmed by the first physiologists of the day, and by those physicians who have had most experience in the treatment of that particular disease, Sir James Clark, Professor Bennett, Dr. Balbirnie, and others. These physicians concur in confirming the observation of others to the effect that indigestion or derangement of the stomach and digestive organs is a universal forerunner of pulmonary consumption, and that without such derangement consumption cannot exist. Consequent on this diseased state of the digestive organs, imperfect blood is assimilated, deficient in its oleaginous elements, and containing an undue amount of albuminous materials. that in consequence of this deficiency of oleaginous elements, the blood is incapable of being converted into true cellular tissue to replace the effete material of the lungs, and the superabundant quantity of albumin has a tendency to exude upon the lungs on their exposure to cold in the form of tubercles, which process is unaccompanied by inflammatory action. These facts are based on long observation and direct chemical analysis of the substance composing the tubercles, which consist of almost pure albumin, and on this theory the wonderful effects of cod liver oil in consumptive cases, and the great emaciation of body which results from the disease are satisfactorily explained. In the one case, the cod liver oil supplies, in a light and digestible form, the oleaginous element in which the blood is deficient. In the other, the system has recourse to the fatty or adipose matter of the body to supply the oleaginous principle. But now the question arises, supposing that indigestion is the universal precursor of consumption, from what does this indigestion and consequent imperfect assimilation of the blood proceed? This question Dr. Lane does not touch upon, but we believe that Dr. Barter, the well-known hydropathic physician of Blarney, considers that it arises from defective vitality 7 in the blood, caused by deficiency of oxygen in the system, more immediately preceding 21, from defective capacity of the lungs and imperfect action of the skin. The skin and lungs, it must be remembered, are supplementary organs. Stop the action of either, and death inevitably ensues, and on their perfect or imperfect action, perfect or imperfect health depends. This view of the disease is illustrated by the history of the monkey. In its wild state, the best authorities state, it never gets consumption, but domesticate the animal, so inducing bad action of the lungs, from want of sufficient exercise and wholesome air, and imperfect action of the skin, arising from the same cause, and it usually dies of this disease. These observations equally apply to all cases of scrofulous degeneration, which physicians estimate as carrying off prematurely 1/6 of the whole human family. 8 of this terrible disease, the scourge of the human race. It is sufficient to observe that consumption is merely a form of it, and that it is, moreover, hereditary, a fact which would corroborate the opinion of its being a true blood disease. Having referred to the fact of the lungs and skin being supplementary organs, the principal duty of both being to aerate the blood, it may be interesting to lay before our readers the following extracts from the results of Monsieur Fourcault's experiments bearing on the subject. These experiments were made with the view of ascertaining the effect of the suppression of transpiration by the skin in animals on coating their bodies with an impermeable varnish. The committee of the French Institute thus describes these experiments. The substances which he used were givet glue, dextrine, pitch, and tar, and several plastic compounds. Sometimes the varnish was made to cover the whole of the animal's body, at other times only a more or less extensive part of it. The accidents which follow this proceeding are more or less complete or incomplete, general or partial. In every case, the health of the animals is soon much impaired and their life in danger. Those which have been submitted to those experiments, under our observation, have died in 1 or 2 days, and in some cases in a few hours only. In the opinion of the committee, these experiments are full of interest. 22. For the future, ******* the experiments of M. Fourcault cannot fail to throw a new light upon the physiological and pathological phenomena, depending upon the double function of inhalation and exhalation of the cutaneous system. Monsieur Fourcault himself thus writes, "The mucous membranes were not the only parts affected by the artificial suppression of the insensible perspiration. We also observed the production of serous effusions in the pericardium and even in the pleura. These effusions thus demonstrate that dropsies are found in the same body as mucus discharges. Several dogs died with paraplegia and could only drag themselves along on their 4 paws. Some died atrophied, and their lungs contained miliary tubercules, which appeared to me, from their whiteness and softness, to be of recent formation. It was, therefore, now impossible to doubt the influence of the suppression of the insensible perspiration of the skin upon the changes in the blood, the mucus and serous exudations, and finally, upon the development of local lesions. But the results of these experiments differ in toto according as the plastering is partial or general, or as it suspends the action of the skin incompletely or completely. In the first case, the alteration of the blood is not carried so far as to cause the dissolution of its organic elements. It can coagulate, and present, in some few cases, a buffy coat of little consistency, bearing some resemblance to that which is found in inflammatory blood. As to the tissues affected, they, however, appear to me to present the anatomical characteristics of the consequences of local inflammation. but when the application of very adhesive substances upon the whole of the body quickly suppresses the cutaneous exhalation and consequently prevents the action of the air upon the skin, death takes place much more speedily and appears to be the result of true asphyxia. The breathing of the animals experimented upon is difficult. They take deep inspirations. In order to inhale a larger quantity of air than usual, their death is violent and is often accompanied by convulsive movements. On dissection, we find in the veins and the right cavities of the heart, sometimes also in the left, but very rarely in the arteries, a black diffluent blood, forming sometimes into soft and diffluent coagula, and coagulating very imperfectly when exposed to atmospherical air. This dissolution of the blood favors the formation of large ecchymoses and of effusions into the lungs and other organs. The capillary vessels are usually injected. One can see that the alteration of the blood has been the true cause of the stagnation of the circulation in this order of vessels. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. It is important to state that man, in the same way as animals, dies from cutaneous asphyxia when his body is covered by impermeable applications. I shall detail, in another work, the results of my researches upon this subject, and facts which still belong to general history will enter into the province of medicine. Thus, at Florence, when Leo X was raised to the pontificate, a child was gilt all over, in order to represent the Golden Age. This unfortunate child soon died, the victim of a physiological experiment of a novel kind. I have gilded, silvered, and tinned several guinea pigs, and all have died like the child at Florence. 23. Monsieur Fourcault, in summing up his researches, remarks as follows. Nasal catarrh, diarrhea, paralysis, marasmus, convulsive movements, and finally the phenomena of asphyxia are also the results of the same experiments. Cutaneous asphyxia may cause the death of man and animals. In this affection, the blood presents, in the highest degree, the refrigerant and stupefying qualities of VEINOUS9 blood. The above extracts are our answer to those superficial medical objectors who would argue that death is not occasioned, in the above instances, by the exclusion of atmospheric air from the system, but by the suppression of poisonous salts secreted in the skin. The effects of the suppression of the most poisonous and irritating of these is well known to the physician, but their phenomena bear no analogy to those presented in the case before us, which exhibits all the symptoms and appearance of true suffocation. If, however, the evidence of these experiments be not sufficient to convince them that a deficient supply of air, producing suffocating symptoms, was the real cause of death in the above cases, we will be prepared to meet them on a more convenient battlefield, where arguments, which would only prove tedious and unintelligible to the non-professional reader, may be freely adduced in support of our position. Were it not tedious to multiply instances, many more might be adduced, such as the dangerous stage of smallpox being contemporaneous with the breaking of the pustules, when the surface of the body becomes partially varnished over, and the fact that a scald or burn is dangerous, not in proportion to its depth, but breadth. Now, if it be conceded that the main cause of consumption, tracing the disease back to its first cause, is to be found in an insufficient supply of oxygen to the system, which certainly the success attendant on a treatment based upon this theory would lead one to suppose, we would beg of our readers seriously to ask themselves how can consumption be cured by drugging, and how can the much required oxygen be supplied to the blood by any proceeding of the kind? We think that the results of such a system afford a conclusive answer to this question, failure marking its course wherever it has been tried. Again, as regards the fashionable remedy of 24, going abroad, 10, how are we likely to get more oxygen supplied to our blood by going abroad than by staying at home? What magic is there in the process? A mild climate may certainly prove less irritating than its native air to a diseased and disordered lung, and the suffering and uneasiness consequent on the irritation may be thereby allayed, but we are not a whit nearer being cured by this device, nor have we, in so doing, properly gone to work to remove the mainspring and cause of the disease. Let our readers bear in mind the following aphorism of Dr. Hall: closed bedrooms make the graves of multitudes. Let them recollect that impure blood is the origin of consumption, and that impure air causes impure blood. Carrying out these principles, and curing consumption, Dr. Barter would use all means to place the system in a favorable condition to receive a full supply of oxygen. First, by a direct inhalation of a mixture of oxygen and atmospheric air through the lungs. Secondly, by enjoining a large amount of active exercise in the open air, when practicable, and sleeping at night with open windows. And thirdly, by inducing a healthy action of the skin, a leaven and consequent supply, through it, of oxygen to the blood by the intervention of the Turkish bath. This mode of treatment has, we believe, proved most successful, whilst the old mode of treatment, of which it is the very antipodes, viz., keeping the patient in a heated and impure atmosphere, swathing him with flannels, 12 dosing him, 25, with prussic acid, and applying a respirator to the mouth, has proved most unsuccessful and fatal. How it could ever have entered into the brain of a physician to recommend the use of a respirator as a cure for consumption, we are at a loss to imagine, as a more ingenious mode of shutting out the pure atmosphere essential to our existence, and exchanging it for one loaded with carbonic acid, thus aggravating the disease which it seeks to cure, could not possibly be devised. Man, in a state of health, requires pure air as a condition of his existence, and can it be supposed that, in a state of disease, he will be able, more successfully, to resist the effects of poison on his system than when in a state of health? Will he, in a state of disease, be strengthened and improved by the loss of that, on a due supply of which, when well, the continuance of his health and strength would depend? Does the experience of our readers furnish them with a single case of recovery from consumption caused by the use of a respirator, or does it not, on the contrary, furnish them, in every case where it has been resorted to, with instances of the bad effects attendant upon its use? In support of the view taken by Dr. Barter, we would observe that narrow and contracted lungs, an impure atmosphere, uncleanly habits, sedentary occupation, indulgence in alcoholic liquors, and overeating, all directly tend to the overloading of the blood with carbon, and they are also the most constant causes of consumption. But the success attending this treatment is the argument which will have most weight with the public, and cause its adoption by the profession at large. When this takes place, we shall not have consumptive patients sent abroad to seek restoration of their health. To Nice, where more native persons die of consumption than in any English town of equal population, to Madeira, where no local disease is more prevalent than consumption, to Malta, where 1/3 of the deaths amongst our troops are caused by consumption, to Naples, whose hospitals record a mortality from consumption of 1 in 2 and 1/3 of the patients, nor, finally, to Florence, where pneumonia is said to be marked by a suffocating character and a rapid progress towards its final stage. Sir James Clark has assailed with much force the doctrine that change of climate is beneficial in cases of consumption. M. Carrière, a French physician, has written strongly against it. Dr. Burgess, an eminent Scotch physician, also contends that climate has little or nothing to do with the cure of consumption, and that if it had, the curative effects would be produced through the skin and not the lungs, by opening the pores, and promoting a better aeration of the blood. With respect to the administering of prussic acid, to lower, 26, the pulse in consumption, we cannot too strongly reprobate this mistaken practice. Do physicians, when prescribing this poison, ever reflect that this elevation of the pulse, which they employ themselves so sedulously to lower, is an effort of nature to supply more oxygen to the system by an increased action of the lungs, and that the more the lungs are injured by disease, the greater is this compensating effort of nature, just as a blacksmith must work a small or defective bellows more rapidly than a large one to keep his fire going. If this be the case, the destructive effects of prussic acid will at once be evident, since by it all the powers of the system become reduced, and nature's efforts at self-relief most mischievously obstructed. The feverish action of the pulse is, in itself, of no moment. It is only as a symptom of derangement in the system that it becomes alarming. It is nature telling us that something is wrong by the very action which she is establishing to cure it. What then must be thought of a practice which silences the telltale pulse, stops the voice of nature, and checks her curative efforts, without attempting to cure the disorder, doing immense mischief, whilst it effects no good? The fact is, the only reduction of the pulse which is worth a farthing, is that which follows naturally from removing the cause of its elevation, viz., a want of oxygen in the system. That the supplying of this want has the effect of lowering the consumptive pulse, without the assistance of prussic acid, is abundantly proved by the rapid fall of the pulse produced by the Turkish bath, a result most satisfactory to the physiologist, as evidencing the soundness of the theory which prescribes it as a remedy. Having referred to the erroneous practice of swathing consumptive patients in flannel, it may not be out of place here to make a few observations on the origin of caloric in the animal system and the office of clothing in relation to it. The only true source of caloric in animals is that produced by the chemical combination of oxygen with the carbon and other oxidizable products of their system. Every cause which quickens and exalts this chemical action increases the animal heat, whilst every interfering cause produces cold and chilliness. It is in this way that drinking cold water or taking exercise in the open air increases the warmth of the body by producing a healthy 13 waste of the system and so stimulating the chemical 27 combustion within it. Clothing, it should be recollected, has merely the effect of retaining animal heat and preventing its dissipation, but it cannot, in the slightest degree, create it. If, therefore, anything occurs to interfere with that action, by which heat can alone be generated, all the clothes in the world will fail to warm us. How little these facts are reflected on is shown by the excessive and injurious amount of clothing worn by delicate persons, which defeats the very object they are intended to effect. These facts also explain the apparent paradox of patients who, previous to undergoing the water system, complain of chilliness when smothered with clothing, but who afterwards are enabled to wear very light clothing, without any feeling of their former chilliness. Point 14 on this subject, Dr. Gully observes. Should, however, the reader desire to learn the most effectual way of destroying the power of generating animal heat, let him pursue the plan which so many shivering patients who come to Malvern have followed. Let him drink spirits and wine, eat condiments, swallow purgatives, and especially mercurials, take a course of iodine, and, as an occasional interlude, lose a little blood, and we stake our reputation that he will shiver to his heart's content, and find himself many degrees lower in the scale of Fahrenheit than cold water, cool air, early rising, and exercise can possibly make him. Before leaving this subject, we would entreat our readers seriously to consider the observations we have addressed to them, and the facts which we have adduced in support of the mode of treatment which we have advocated. The subject is one of serious moment, since, on this disease being rightly understood, the lives of millions of our countrymen depend. If a rational mode of treatment be adopted, its fearful ravages may be successfully encountered and stayed, but if not, the gaunt specter will stalk as hitherto, unchecked through the length and breadth of our island, dealing death to millions of its sons. With regard to water drinking, an important part of the hydropathic process, and against which much prejudice exists, the following extracts from the pen of the justly celebrated allopathic physician, Sir Henry Holland, will not, we hope, be considered out of place. In his work styled Medical Notes and Reflections, treating of diluents, he thus writes, "Though there may seem little reason for considering these as a separate class of remedies, yet I doubt whether the principles of treatment, 28, implied in the name is sufficiently regarded in modern practice. On the continent, indeed, the use of diluents is much more extensive than in England, and, under the form of mineral waters especially, makes up in some countries a considerable part of general practice. But putting aside all question as to mineral ingredients in water, the consideration more expressly occurs, to what extent and with what effects this great diluent, the only one which really concerns the animal economy, may be introduced into the system as a remedy? Looking at the definite proportion which, in a healthy state, exists in all parts of the body between the aqueous, saline, and animal ingredients, at the various organs destined, directly or indirectly, to regulate the proportion, and at the morbid results, occurring whenever it is materially altered, we must admit the question as one very important in the animal economy, and having various relation to the causes and treatment of disease. Keeping in mind then this reference to the use of water as an internal remedy, diluents may be viewed under three conditions of probable usefulness. First, the mere mechanical effect of quantity of liquid in diluting and washing away matters, excrementitious or noxious, from the alimentary canal. Secondly, their influence in modifying certain morbid conditions of the blood. And thirdly, their effect upon various functions of secretion and excretion, and especially upon those of the kidneys and skin. The first is an obvious benefit in many cases, and not to be disdained from any notion of its vulgar simplicity. It is certain there are many states of the alimentary canal in which the free use of water at stated times produces good, which cannot be attained by other or stronger remedies. I have often known the action of the bowels to be maintained with regularity for a long period, simply by a tumbler of water, warm or cold, on an empty stomach, in cases where medicine had almost lost its effect, or become a source only of distressing irritation. The advantage of such treatment is still more strongly attested where the secretions taking place into the intestines, or the products formed there during digestion, become vitiated in kind. Here dilution lessens that irritation to the membranes, which we cannot so readily obviate by other means, and aids in removing the cause from the body with less distress than any other remedy. In some cases, where often and largely used, its effect goes farther in actually altering the state of the secreting surfaces by direct application to them. I mention these circumstances upon experience, having often obtained much good from resorting to them in practice when stronger medicines and ordinary methods had proved of little avail. Dilution thus used, for example, so as to act on the contents of the bowels, is beneficial in many dyspeptic cases, where it is especially an object to avoid needless irritation to the system. Half a pint or more of water taken when fasting, at the temperature most agreeable to the patient, will often be found to give singular relief to his morbid sensations. ***** In reference to the foregoing uses of diluents, it is to be kept in mind that the lining of the alimentary canal is, to all intents, a surface, as well as the skin, pretty nearly equal in extent, exercising some similar functions, with others more appropriate to itself, and capable in many respects of being acted upon in a similar manner. As respects the subject before us, it is both expedient and correct in many cases to regard diluents as acting on this internal surface analogously to liquids on the skin. And I would apply this remark not only to the mechanical effects of the remedy, but also to their use as the medium for conveying cold to internal parts, a point 29 of practice which either the simplicity of the means, or the false alarms besetting it, have hitherto prevented from being duly regarded. Again he writes, without reference, however, to these extreme cases, it must be repeated that the use of water, simply as a diluent, scarcely receives attention and discrimination enough in our English practice. And again, as I have been treating of this remedy only in its simplest form, I do not advert to the use of the different mineral waters farther than to state that they confirm these general views, separating, as far as can be done, their effect as diluents from that of the ingredients they contain. The copious employment of some of them in continental practice gives room for observation, which is wanting under our more limited use. I have often seen 5 or 6 pints taken daily for some weeks together, a great part of it in the morning while fasting, with singular benefit in many cases to the general health, and most obviously to the state of the secretions. These courses, however, were always conjoined with ample exercise and regular habits of life, doubtless influencing much the action of the waters, and aiding their salutary effect. With this quotation we take leave of Sir Henry Holland, merely observing that no hydropathist could say more on the subject than he has done, and that the continental practice referred to, of drinking large quantities of water, conjoined with ample exercise and regular habits of life, is precisely that practice which hydropathy enjoins. Sir John Forbes, a physician already quoted, says, on water drinking, the water cure is a stomachic, since it invariably increases the appetite. Dr. Pereira states, it is a vital stimulus, and is more essential to our existence than aliment. Liebig, the celebrated physiological chemist, bears similar testimony, viz., it increases the appetite. Are these effects consistent with lowering the tone of the stomach? Are they not, on the contrary, the strongest evidence of the tonic effects of water? Some objectors say water drinking thins the blood. After demolishing these objections by arguments which we regret we have not space to quote, Dr. Gully concludes his observations as follows. But the whole assertion regarding thin blood proceeds on grounds that betray intense ignorance, both of physiology and of the water cure. It supposes that the whole water imbibed enters into, and remains in the circulating blood, quasi-water, that no chemical transformation of it takes, place in the body at all. This is ignorance of physiology. And it supposes that all who are treated by water are told to drink the same, and that a large quantity, without discrimination of the individual cases of disease presented. This is ignorance of the water cure. So between the horns of this compound ignorance and of willful misrepresentation, we leave the declaimers about the thinning of the blood. It is a curious fact that in all the medical works which treat of anemia or bloodlessness, allusion is never once made to water drinking as a known cause, not even to the possibility of its being a cause of it. In so flagrant a case of thin blood, why has this principal cause been omitted? It is further curious that this injurious effect of water was never invented, much less preached, until hydropathy was found to be making inconvenient strides in public favor.